Welcome to People and Profit, your essential business briefing. Coming up, Italy's budget battle, why government debt is key to the standoff with the European Union. Is there any end in sight to the US-China trade war? We'll hear from the head of the International Trade Centre. And does an unseasonably warm October in France bring any heat to the economy? First up, though, Italy has been reprimanded by the European Union and told it must produce a revised budget for next year. Rome's spending plans create a minimum income for welfare recipients and scrap plans to increase the retirement age. Those measures come at a cost, though, and the increased budget deficit has drawn criticism from the European Commission. A bigger deficit is particularly worrying for Italy because of its high level of government debt, something pointed out by EU Commissioner Pierre Moscovici.
Reducing this mountain of debt has to be a strategic priority for Italy. A country that can't do anything about its debt is a country that's becoming weaker and cannot conduct public policies in the interest of its citizens.
So why is there more concern over certain countries' debts? Kate Moody's been looking into this. Kate.
Well, Stephen, when a government is spending more than it's bringing in taxes, it can raise funds by issuing bonds. The bond yield, effectively the interest rate, fluctuates depending on how confident investors are about the country's ability to repay them. Investors get their information from ratings agencies, who issue credit ratings based on an assessment of an economy, including its budget deficit. Bonds are seen as a safe investment as their yield is fixed for a certain number of years or months. Their stability attracts investors like other governments, corporations, including banks and pension funds, and even members of the public. European governments have been issuing huge amounts of bonds since the financial crisis, 630 billion euros worth in the first half of this year alone, to boost their cash flow and take advantage of low borrowing costs. That means their debt piles have grown substantially. Now, debt loads are usually expressed as a percentage relative to a size of the country's economy. That means if your economy is growing, your debt looks more manageable. That's why there are fewer immediate worries about America's high debt level than there are in Greece and Italy, because there's a high level of confidence that the US will be able to pay its bills on time. If debt increases, more money needs to be put aside for interest and repayments. Down the line, that can affect things like pensions or health care. It's one of the reasons the Eurozone tries to keep all its member states on an even keel. Analysts say a deficit of about 2% or under tends to keep debt on a downward trend. Stephen?
Kate, thank you very much for that. Next, how long will the trade war between the United States and China last? President Trump's top economic advisor has accused Chinese authorities of refusing to engage in discussions. Larry Kudlow says that Beijing hasn't responded to its list of demands on issues like technology. President Trump will meet his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping at the G20 meeting in Argentina next month, and there are hopes of kick-starting talks on resolving the dispute. Well, for more on this, I'm joined in the studio by Arancha Gonzales, who's the Executive Director of the International Trade Centre, which is a joint agency of the UN and the WTO. Thank you very much for coming to speak to us.
My pleasure.
Are you optimistic that there could be progress made on the US-China relations, given that we have this upcoming meeting of President Xi and President Trump?
Well, I certainly do hope that the two sides come to the table and they start discussing the differences they have. The differences span well beyond trade. They are more geopolitical in nature. But the only answer to address them in a rational way is to sit around the table, to meet, to put on the table what each one of them has, and both will have grievances, and then start discussing them. If possible, starting with the two, but if possible, getting into a larger table, because at the end of the day, whatever they do has an impact on the rest of the world. So it's only fair that the rest of the world also sit at the table to try to find a solution.
What have we learned about trade and global trade since the tariffs started back in January? It's only 10 months, but it feels like there's been so many controversies since then in this area.
Well, I think we've learned two things. One is that trade is a manifestation of how our economies are interconnected and how much what one does impacts on the other. And the second thing we have learned, and it's a consequence of this first one, is that unilateral solutions don't work. That unilateral solutions may be good at pointing at the problem, at sharpening the edges of the problem, but it's not enough in terms of solutions. That our interconnection, we call it globalization, but we could call it technology, we could call it the digital economy. It doesn't matter which way we call it. Our economies are too linked today for us to be able to solve our challenges in a unilateral manner.
Do you think when we talk about the US and China, do you think there's a will there to solve this dispute that they have ongoing after all of the escalations?
Well, I think they have two avenues in front of them. One, they sit and they have the multilateral system, or the system, so to speak, the rules and regulations, the checks and balances we've built since the Second World War, mediating the dispute between them. Or the other avenue, which is they take down the system that we have, meaning the world of rules and the regulations that we live in today. They take it down in their fight. I would certainly prefer the first one, because I don't think that a world in which in a multipolar world, which is where we are today, two big players in this multipolarity fighting is going to be of any good to the rest of the world.
There has been some progress, it seems, between the US and the EU on the issue of trade. You know, they've had discussions, they've calmed the tensions that were there. President Trump even seeking permission from Congress to negotiate a trade deal. Do you see that as being a step in the right direction?
Well, I think this is a realization of how important the transatlantic economic and trade relation is. When you trade with somebody else over $1 billion today, a day, which is what happens today, there is no other avenue than to sit and discuss how you can manage this relationship better. You see, there's always going to be tensions between the US and the European Union. Both have different approaches on issues that are fundamental in today's world. Both have different approaches to, for example, dealing with data. And data is the new gold in the digital economy. They have different approaches to safety and security. But at the end of the day, their economic and trade relationship is too important not to address it in a cooperative manner. And as they do that, not to include others in this conversation, because at the end of the day, as they breathe with each other, they breathe also with the rest of the world.
It's interesting to mention data, because we've had Tim Cook say that, you know, there is a big kind of market around data as well that the US needs to catch up on. Are we going to see these sort of elements now included in trade discussions that perhaps weren't there before?
Well, what I certainly see is countries having to juggle with the tension that exists between making sure that data flows and that data oils the digital economy of the 21st century, facilitating trade, but also protecting the use of this data against abuses. And this tension that is there is going to have to be addressed. Countries are addressing it at the moment, in my view, in too much of their way, unilaterally. In my view, it would be interesting for this, if you see, if we are so interconnected, our data is also very interconnected. It would be good to have a bit of a discussion about how do we create more trust with consumers while we facilitate the flow of this digital economy in the 21st century, and opening up a debate on that.
And that has to be achieved at an international level. Including,
why not, at the World Trade Organization, but there may be other fora to do that. It would be important, because at the end of the day, if I do it my way, you do it your way, the US does it its way, China does it its own way, we are going to fragment the playing field. And the economy of the 21st century, remember, is a digital economy, where what would matter is that we limit this fragmentation.
It's been a tumultuous 2018 for global trade. When we look at 2019, we've got Brexit coming up. Are we going to see new and more complicated issues around this subject emerging, do you think?
Well, I think the big question mark on Brexit remains, has been up until now and remains, a discussion within the United Kingdom about what kind of integration the United Kingdom wants with the rest of the world, starting with its closest neighbour, with whom it is today in an integrated market called the European Union. And this answer is to be provided by London. It cannot be provided by the rest of the world. It certainly cannot be provided by the rest of the European Union. It is a discussion that they need to have in the UK. And what, in my view, has happened in this last months is that it's becoming, the costs and the benefits of the different options they are playing with are becoming sharper. And in particular, the cost of not integrating in a smart way with the European Union is becoming sharper. And it's also haunting many that would not want Brexit to work to the detriment of Brits.
OK, Arancha Gonzales from the International Trade Centre, thank you very much for speaking to us.
My pleasure.
Now, back here in France, the country is seeing its warmest October in 70 years. That's having an impact on various sectors of the economy, with mixed results. Peter O'Brien reports.
A lake so low you can cycle on it. In Annecy, The school holidays aren't looking good for the tourist sector, despite the sun. Water levels are low. It's difficult to bring out the pedalos, and nobody's dined on this floating restaurant for weeks.
The boat is descending slowly. It's only a few centimetres from touching the ground, so we're blocked.
Meanwhile, in the north of France, the heat means potatoes are growing smaller than usual, making them difficult to sell.
All of this is smaller than 40 millimetres, so that's already 4 potatoes less. This one's green, and we've only got 6 remaining.
But there's an upside to the unusual weather. Businesses such as restaurants and campsites across the country are experiencing a late rush of customers. They've had to adapt to the change in seasons. 3 years ago, this campsite in Landes in southwestern France decided to start closing for winter as late as November the 1st.
For some time, we've noticed that the weather is much more stable during this period. We're now doing more business after the summer than before it.
In this restaurant in Corrèze, the owner no longer needs to ask customers if they want to sit outside or not.
Normally, October is quiet, but this year we're extending our season to make up for a rainy spring, which wasn't great. So we're happy.
France is having the hottest October in 70 years. This trend is becoming normal, and in the future, the tourist season could end not in September, but November.
Well, the good weather may come and go, but you'll always find the best of our business coverage on our Facebook page, France 24 Business, or you can tweet me with your comments at @NewStephen. Until next time, thanks for watching.
Idi Amin Dada, Uganda's despotic leader, presided over his country in the 70s. He is remembered in very different ways. Some recall the hundreds of thousands who were killed and tortured. However, those who were born after that horrific era laud his lesser-known accomplishments. For them, he was as a builder, a nationalist and a separatist, the leader of time in Uganda's history, which they regard as a bygone golden era.
We revisit the compiler of Idi Amin Dada here on France 24.